and welcome to the TF1 show. I'm your host, Tinus, and today we will be talking about a subject and a driver very close to my heart. Now, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, or in other words, if you're my mother, you'll be quick to remember that throughout the whole year I've been rabbiting on about Carlos Sainz and how underrated he is. Just go and listen to a couple of my past episodes and chances are you'll hear me harping on about Mr. Sainz and how I think he is God's gift to mankind. Well, I've decided that it's high time I talk the talk and walk the walk and give Carlos the thing he most desires in this world. A whole episode of the TF1 show as a shrine to his excellence and brilliance. So here we go. Carlos Sainz Jr. was born on a cold winter's night on the 1st of September of 1994 in Madrid. Now, I guess September in the Northern Hemisphere is probably autumn, so, couldn't have been a winter's night. But no matter, it's interesting to note that Carlos's father, Carlos Sainz Sr., is also a racing driver with fantastic successes in Dakar and Rally. Now, like most Formula 1 drivers, Carlos started out at a very young age in karting and had moderate success through karting over the years. Now, interestingly, he didn't have the runaway success in the junior formulae that some of his peers or contemporaries had. I think we can stop the sweet, relaxing music there since things become quite a bit less rosy for Carlos Sainz after his karting career. Well, I guess we can say that he was firstly signed as a Red Bull Racing Junior quite early on in his career, which I think is quite an achievement and is definitely something that would become very important for him when he was a little bit older. But just to give a quick overview of the sort of single-seater racing series he participated in. He participated in Formula W, in Formula 3, in Formula Renault, in GP3, and he had good results here and there. There was some poles and race wins and fastest laps scattered through each of the seasons, but he was never able to completely string a solid, consistent championship fight together. He was never, winning these or coming second in these season-long championships. And I think just at that specific point, when you look at his junior career like that, it just wasn't that remarkable, especially if you compare to obviously the stellar junior careers of Lewis Hamilton, of Charles Leclerc, of Nico Hulkenberg, Stoffel Van Dorn, Max Verstappen. All of those guys had sort of headline careers in juniors where they were just cleaning up championships left, right, and center. Now, I guess the flip side of the argument is also true, where you've had many very, very successful junior drivers that never actually made it to the big time in F1. So that's not a hard and fast rule. But I think the point can definitely be made that Carlos Sainz was never regarded as the most significant up-and-coming junior that the Formula 1 world was waiting for. And then all of a sudden he was able to string together a solid campaign in Formula Renault 3.5 in 2014, where he won the championship and he actually beat Pierre Gasly, who then actually continued on with a more conventional junior career, with Gasly winning the GP2 title in 2016. But nevertheless, Carlos Sainz's Formula Renault 3.5 championship victory and the way he basically did throughout caught the eye of Helmut Marko, who's obviously the head of the Red Bull Junior Development Program, and he was promoted immediately into the Toro Rosso F1 team for the 2015 season alongside a bloke called Max Verstappen. Now, obviously, when Max joined F1 in 2015 as a 17-year-old, there was a massive amount of press and a lot of opinions and a lot of worries and a lot of drama with this very, very young guy that wasn't technically even able to drive on the roads yet, all of a sudden in the state-of-the-art, bespoke, top-of-the-line single-seater race series in the world. So, consequently, Carlos Sainz's introduction to Formula 1 flew a bit under the radar. I think we can safely say that. And obviously, I remember watching that first race in Australia in 2015 with all of the interest around Max Verstappen and all of the other intrigue going on, typically as it does in Formula One. But I just distinctly remember watching Carlos Sainz drive and thinking, this guy is actually very impressive, or for a debut. And if I remember correctly, actually finished in the points, and he finished ahead of Verstappen. But my memory could be wrong. But I just have the distinct memory of being very impressed by Carlos Sainz. And I was continually impressed by Carlos Sainz throughout the season, especially at the beginnings of the season, where over the opening races, he was very much, I think, matching Verstappen in terms of overall pace and overall racecraft and things like that. Now, Max was obviously a lot more flashy in terms of he went for all sorts of daring overtakes and all sorts of interesting things, which then led to him retiring more often than not. But Carlos was just there in the background doing his good old thing, stringing the races together, scoring a few good points. And then all of a sudden, Sainz had 4 consecutive retirements in the middle of the season, which I think sort of stifled his momentum by quite a lot, and led to a bit of that inconsistency that I spoke about earlier in his junior career creeping in. So moving on to the 2016 season, he was partnered with Verstappen again, where they were neck and neck over the opening couple of races in terms of points scored. Not much to separate the two. Again, I think showing how well Sainz was able to perform against Verstappen. And then obviously the very, very controversial switch at Red Bull, where Verstappen was promoted into the team and Kvyat was demoted from Red Bull back to Toro Rosso. Now, and we all remember how Max Verstappen won his first race with Red Bull Racing in Spain. But I think it's worth remembering and worth mentioning that Sainz himself put in a brilliant performance that day in Spain, where he drove his Toro Rosso to 6th place. And during the remainder of the season, he comprehensively defeated Kvyat. Also allowing, I guess, for the fact that Kvyat was a bit down and out after the whole demotion debacle. But nevertheless, we then swiftly move on to the 2017 season, where it was initially another one at Toro Rosso, which then became a season with Renault later on in the season, when Jolyon Palmer was fired and Carlos Sainz, after confirming the fact that he would be driving for the team in 2018. So Carlos was moved up into the Renault team early or later on in the 2017 season specifically. Some highlights for that season was just his brilliant 4th position he scored in Singapore in mixed conditions while he was still driving for Toro Rosso. And I think this highlighted a specific skill that Carlos has that isn't very highly publicized, but I think should be very much shouted from the rooftops. And that is his ability in wet and mixed conditions. I think he's up there in terms of one of the best drivers in conditions like these. And if you go and look back at his career and his performance in races like this, he's almost always outperforming his car and, just doing a very, very good job overall. And this 4th that he got in Singapore and Toro Rosso very much underlined that fact. And I think the 2017 season overall was his most consistent season to date, or up to that point, where he finished 3rd in the Formula 1.5 championship. So in other words, that means, not allowing for the top 6. He came 7th, 8th, 9th in the overall championship, behind the 2 Force India drivers. Now, the Force India drivers had definitely a faster car that year than both the Renault or the Toro Rosso. So overall, a very strong performance by Carlos in 2017. Which then meant we moved to 2018 and his first season at Renault, which was, I think, his weakest season. And I think most people agree that probably wasn't his strongest season. He showed some inconsistency again, and he was up against a very experienced and strong teammate in Nico Hülkenberg. And we all know my feelings toward Hülkenberg as well. So I think a difficult season for Sainz, especially given that it was his first season at Renault in a new team, the new car, new environment, with Hülkenberg being much more comfortable there already. He still had some good results overall, some high placements in, a lot of points finishes as well. So definitely not a poor season, but not, I wouldn't say his standout or exemplary season. Then speaking of, I think we can then move on to 2019, which is his first season with McLaren. Now, just for a bit of background, if you don't know what happened, or if you lived under a rock or didn't follow Formula One at that point in time, at the end of the mid 2018 season, it was a very, very confusing time for all of us following Formula One, because we didn't know where all of the different drivers were going to go, which teams were going to sign which drivers, things like that. And Daniel Ricciardo made the surprise move and shocked the entire paddock when he dropped to Red Bull and moved to Renault, which then meant that Carlos Sainz was without a drive for the 2019 season. But luckily, he was able to secure a 2-year deal with McLaren at that point in time. And obviously, McLaren was a team that was also trying to rebuild themselves and to build themselves back up to the mighty team they once was. And this is where the fireworks began. Now, I'm going to give a quick just a rundown of all of Carlos's highlights over the past season. I guess we need to start with his podium in Brazil, so the most recent race, where he drove from 20th on the grid to 3rd in a midfield car, which I thought was an absolutely incredible achievement. He has 3 other 5th places, 3 6th places, a 7th place, and 3 8th places, with one of those 8th places also being the very, very fantastic performance that he had in Austria, where he again drove, I think, up from 17th on the grid to 8th place. Now, in an environment as competitive as the midfield in Formula One this year, I think the consistency of these positions and these placements, the fact that he was so consistently ahead of everybody else, I think is the real outstanding achievement here, where obviously we saw with Toro Rosso, with both of the drivers here and there, you can score a lucky podium or a lucky 4th place, but to be there and to put yourself in the position to be there almost each and every single race, I think was what was one of the very impressive aspects of Carlos' season. And I don't know if you guys remember, but actually another very impressive performance was where Sainz was challenging Verstappen for 5th in, I think, in the Bahrain Grand Prix, where they were sort of wheel-to-wheel racing through the corners, Sainz not backing down for Verstappen at all, and then a puncture actually ruined his race there. So not a great outcome, I guess, for Sainz, but just the way he's been competing the whole year has been very impressive. And then we need to ask ourselves the question. Now, obviously, there are some clear contenders in Lewis Hamilton and Verstappen and maybe Leclerc, but can we consider Carlos Sainz to perhaps be the best driver of 2019? I think he's definitely in the conversation. I think there are a few things we need to consider. And firstly, he has definitely shown the trademarks of, the very best drivers this year, which is basically his consistency, which is, I think, something he struggled a bit with in the past, but this year it's just been like a metronome. Every single race, it's just been banging in the 5th and the 6th and the 7th places, never making mistakes. He's always putting his car in the right place, ensuring the strategy works out for him. He's just been incredibly consistent in terms of his results and in terms of, his driving of the car and staying out of trouble. He's shown the speed, maybe not the ultimate speed like Lewis Hamilton or Leclerc possesses, but very similar to his idol Fernando Alonso. He's been, again, very consistently fast in qualifying. He never has an off day. He never really messes up his qualifying laps. He's always there putting in a good lap or a decent lap at least, albeit maybe not the fastest lap of the weekend on an overall level. And next thing that Sainz has shown so well this year is his great team working dynamic with obviously his rookie teammate Lando Norris, as well as with the just the McLaren team in general. I think they've cultivated such a positive working environment in that team now, and the 2 new drivers coupled with the team's sort of resurgence, and I think it's just created an environment where they can now properly focus to close the gap between the top 3 teams and themselves, and to maybe haul McLaren right back up to where they used to be. And I don't think we need to discount or underestimate Sainz's as well as Lando Norris's contribution in this sense, in restoring a bit of harmony, a bit of positivity in that team. And it's just, I think, such a wonderful atmosphere to be a part of at the moment. Now, another thing that we need to talk about with regards to Carlos Sainz, and that's something that's sort of been mentioned every now and again, but I'd like to proclaim it to the world and just talk about how clever I think Carlos is, especially in terms of car setup and understanding the car. Now, you can see things like this where especially it's shown in where you can see the big jumps that Sainz especially makes from Friday practice to the Saturday morning practice and into qualifying, where quite often McLaren is actually very much struggling in terms of outright pace, struggling in terms of, even in relation to the other midfield teams. And then somehow, or surprisingly, Sainz and the McLaren team are able to gain a lot of time over that Friday to Saturday evening and then be right back on the pace for qualifying, and more often than not actually being the best of the race team in qualifying at the end of the day. Now, I think that's obviously a function of having, good engineers and a good understanding of their car, but also a function of Carlos Sainz, really understanding where there are difficulties with the car, how to address it, what feedback to give, how to actually, change the car to be more to his liking. And I think that then leads to the confidence as well that we've seen from him this year, which has led to the consistency as well. The last two things I want to mention, I think, about Carlos that has been so impressive this year is something that I've touched on before, is his wet weather prowess. Now, he hasn't really had the opportunity to demonstrate it too much this year, but there have been hints of this. If you think about how his performance in Germany, maybe not he didn't get a podium like Kvyat or almost got one like Stroll, but they got a bit lucky with strategy where Sainz drove, I think, along with Alex Albon, they were probably the two strongest performers, but Sainz drove such a good controlled race. He almost went off once, almost hit the barrier, but he was able to, save himself from that and continue on in a very, very positive way. Put in a very good performance in Germany to finish, I think, 5th, if I'm not mistaken. And then also something that I picked up, if you remember, in Monza on the Friday, there were actually 2 rainy practices. And along with Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen, who else do you think was on top of the timesheets? It was Mr. Carlos Sainz in his McLaren, beating the Ferraris and beating the other Red Bulls, and just, putting his car in places where it has no business of being. And I think that's just a testament to how good he is in the rain. And then the last thing I want to mention about Carlos's performance this year is how excellent his opening laps have been this year, where he's almost always gaining positions over the opening lap of the Grand Prix. McLaren, they've had very good starts from the line, but then Sainz has always been able to make up quite a lot of positions over, just through the couple of first corners. He's already made up 2, 3, 4 spots, which I think is, again, very Alonso-like in his execution, and I think will bode very well for him going forward. I think the best example of this is probably his opening lap in Monaco, where he, had pulled 2 ridiculous passes to, I think, on the Toro Rossos, both Toro Rossos in front of him. And it was just like over the first 2, 3 corners over the, on the opening lap of Monaco, which is obviously notoriously ridiculous and difficult to pass on. He was able to make those passes stick, and then went on to finish in another strong result for the team. But I guess the last race in Brazil is probably the one that exemplified everything that Sainz is good at, and all of the things that I mentioned just now when I was talking about his season. Now, the fact that he was able to manage that race on a one-stop strategy, where almost everybody else went on a 2-stop, I think is something noteworthy. It shows that he can actually manage a race, manage his tires, drive within the parameters of the car, and keeping that in mind, then he was also able to make a lot of decisive overtakes when required. When he made the pit stop for his one set of tires on his new tires, he was able to make those passes stick, to move up in the field as quickly as possible in order to make the strategy work for him. And then with the 2 safety car restarts at the end of the race, when his tires were obviously much, much older, he was able to keep, think about Roman Grosjean and many other guys on much, much newer tires than what he was on. He was able to keep them behind him with some very robust and creative defense, and he actually did not lose one position in that entire skirmish. And that, I guess, shows both management skills, attack skills, and defensive skills all in one race, which then culminated in his best result in Formula One to date. Now, I've gushed about Carlos Sainz's 2019 season, I guess, a lot, and it's probably enough now, which means we can ask ourselves maybe why he has shown so much improvement. If we can identify the reasons that have led to Carlos having such an impressive season at McLaren in 2019. Now, obviously McLaren has made a massive step forward, and we can't discount the fact that that team has produced a car that has allowed Carlos to really show his abilities and to really make things happen for him. But I think for him specifically, the skill has always been there. I think Carlos Sainz has always had the skills and the speed, and we saw that with his good results that he had in his junior categories. But the thing that always kept, him from really achieving great things was his consistency. And I think this year he's finally managed to get that race-to-race consistency, and is actually probably one of the most consistent drivers in the whole field. I think maybe only Lewis Hamilton can claim to be more consistent than Carlos Sainz. And I think a main reason for this is the fact that previously he was permanently on 1-year renewable contracts. So his 2 years or 2.75 years at Toro Rosso, all of them were 1-year renewable contracts. So he had to drive for his seat for the next year every year. And then the one at Renault that he had in 2018 was a renewable contract 1 year as well. Where in 2019, for the first time, he actually has a 2-year contract with McLaren, which means this year he can actually drive without having to worry about having a seat for next year. And he can just make sure that he does the best job he possibly can. And, over and above that is just, I think, the fact that at McLaren at the moment, there's much less politics and infighting, where at Toro Rosso and at Red Bull, in that sort of Red Bull junior drivers program, it always feels like you're in some sort of war of attrition with all of the other juniors in order to firstly get a seat in Formula One, and then secondly keep your seat in Formula One. And we all know how ruthless that program is, and I think it's definitely not the most positive environment to operate in. Where at McLaren, I think he can now make the team his own, he can develop the team, he can grow himself into the team, and I think this gives him the confidence to drive like he wants to, and the results obviously this year are showing just exactly that. And I do think that Red Bull must be very, very annoyed by sort of this development and how well Sainz is driven this year, since they effectively chose Pierre Gasly over Carlos Sainz at the end of last year to join Max in the Red Bull. And we all know how that turned out. Now we need to ask ourselves, dear friends, can Sainz drive for a top team like Mercedes, Ferrari or Red Bull in the near future? And I think the answer to that is that he could, but there are always such a deep pool of internal talent in those teams that it's going to be a while for someone like Sainz to be at the top of their list if they do always have internally funded young drivers that they can push into those specific seats. But then we also need to ask ourselves, would Carlos even want to drive for those three teams? With the way that McLaren is going, Sainz is speedily building up a team around him that seems to be improving race after the race, and who knows, we might see McLaren competing for podium soon, and then I guess the fireworks will truly start. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my ode to Carlos Sainz, a driver I've always rated highly, which this year has shown to be a true force in the sport. Now join me as we head to the final race of the F1 season next week in Abu Dhabi, where we will hopefully once again be able to watch Carlos Sainz apply his craft. In the meantime, please give me a subscription, a like, a review or a comment, and you can also follow me on Twitter, where my handle is @the TF1show, or on Instagram, where my handle is @the TF1show. Thanks as always for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.